whether you're eating, studying, driving, hitting the gym, or just killing time. If you want to think deeper, question more, and actually understand the world, subscribe to the History Trending podcast.
You know, when you pick up a modern bestseller, there is this fundamental assumption of stability.
Yeah, you just trust what is on the page.
Right. You assume the words printed there are the exact words the author finalized on their laptop.
Exactly.
Whether you buy a copy in New York or Tokyo or, download it to an e-reader, it is a fixed, permanent artifact.
It doesn't change.
But if you step back into the ancient world, specifically the world of early Christian writings, that assumption just completely shattered.
Oh, it falls apart entirely.
We are looking at a textual landscape that is incredibly fluid, where the very act of reading and copying a document, well, it inherently changed the document itself.
It is a totally different paradigm.
So today we are taking a deep dive into the meticulous science of textual criticism. We are using Bart Ehrman's incredibly eye-opening book, Misquoting Jesus, alongside our own research notes as our guide.
It is such a fascinating topic.
It really is. We are going to figure out why we don't actually possess a single original copy of the New Testament, and how centuries of copying by hand physically shaped the text that millions read today.
And we really need to emphasize just how fluid this landscape was.
Yeah, please do, because the statistics are wild.
They are. Consider this. When looking at the thousands of surviving ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, there are actually more differences among those manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament itself.
That is that is a staggering reality.
It immediately forces us to reevaluate how we view ancient literature.
Right.
Because to understand why that statistic exists, we have to look at the unique culture of early Christianity.
Because it was different from the surrounding culture.
Very different. Unlike most religions in the ancient Greco-Roman world, which were primarily centered on, civic ritual, temple priesthoods, animal sacrifice.
Very action-based stuff.
Exactly. But Christianity inherited from Judaism a profound reverence for sacred texts. It was a highly bookish religion right from its inception.
They operated on the core belief that the divine will was communicated directly through written documents.
Yes, the texts were everything.
Okay, let us unpack this. Because the sheer weight of these manuscript differences isn't just an abstract data point for historians to log in a spreadsheet.
No, it has massive implications.
Profound philosophical and personal implications. And we see this play out perfectly in the life of Bart Ehrman himself.
His story is really the perfect lens for this.
Yeah, his trajectory shows how a seemingly dry academic problem regarding ancient translation can trigger a massive crisis of faith.
Ehrman's personal journey is essential context here, because he didn't start out as this skeptical academic looking to deconstruct the text.
Right, he wasn't looking for flaws.
Not at all. He grew up in the 1950s in Kansas in a fairly casual religious environment, but a profound experience in high school through youth group gave him an intense driving passion for the Christian faith.
He became totally dedicated.
He did, and that zeal led him to enroll at the Moody Bible Institute.
Which, from the sources, sounds essentially like a strict fundamentalist boot camp.
That is a very accurate way to describe it.
The core theological tenet they hammered home there was the doctrine of verbal plenary inspiration.
Yes.
Basically, the belief that the text is the inerrant, divinely inspired word of God down to the exact literal words, plenary meaning absolute and verbal meaning the actual vocabulary.
The premise being that if the divine dictated it, there can be zero mistakes of any kind.
Right, not a single typo.
Precisely. They taught that the Bible was a flawless blueprint. But Ehrman was incredibly bright, and he was deeply motivated to master these texts.
He really wanted to get to the bottom of it.
So he progressed to Wheaton College to learn ancient Greek. His logic was sound. If the text is verbally inspired, you have to read the actual words in their original language.
Because every translation is inherently an interpretation.
Exactly. You lose something in translation. And this is where the cracks began to form for him.
Because he recognized a really problematic exclusivity there, didn't he?
He did.
I mean, if the full untainted meaning of the divine word is only available in ancient Greek, then this doctrine of inspiration effectively applies only to a highly educated elite, people who have the time and resources to learn dead languages.
That was the first philosophical hurdle he hit.
That makes total sense.
But the real structural damage to his worldview happened later, when he was at Princeton Theological Seminary.
Oh, this is the story about the term paper, right?
Yes. He was taking an advanced class on the Gospel of Mark. And he wrote this massive convoluted term paper trying to justify a glaring historical discrepancy in Mark chapter 2.
What was the discrepancy?
Well, in the text, Jesus references King David's actions in the Old Testament, specifically noting that Abiathar was the high priest at the time.
Okay.
But if you actually cross-reference that with the book of 1 Samuel, the high priest wasn't Abiathar. It was his father, Ahimelech.
Oh, so it's just a straightforward historical mismatch.
Exactly. A classic slip of the memory by the author of Mark.
But Ehrman couldn't accept that.
No, because of his training. So he writes this incredibly complex exegetical argument, twisting the Greek syntax into knots to explain how it's actually not a mistake at all.
I can just picture this dense 20-page paper.
Right. And his professor, a revered scholar named Colin Story, reads this entire dense argument and simply writes one line at the end of the paper.
What did he write?
He just wrote, maybe Mark just made a mistake.
Wow. Just like that.
That single sentence dismantled years of theological scaffolding for Ehrman.
I mean, it is like pulling a loose thread on a sweater. If you admit one tiny historical mistake exists, like swapping a priest's name, doesn't the entire architecture of an errant blueprint start to buckle?
It completely unravels.
It forces a much bigger question. What good is a doctrine claiming the exact words were divinely inspired if we don't actually possess the original words to begin with?
This raises an important question, and it is the exact realization that propelled Ehrman away from literalism and into his professional focus on textual criticism.
Right.
Because textual criticism is the meticulous science of attempting to restore those original words, what scholars call the autographs, from the thousands of flawed, contradictory copies we do have.
Because, as we pointed out, the original texts are completely lost to history.
Gone. They likely disintegrated within a few decades of being written.
Wait, if we don't have a single original document, and we are relying entirely on copies of copies of copies, who exactly is doing the copying in those first few centuries?
That is a great question.
Because my immediate mental image, and I think most people's, is a highly organized scriptorium with trained monks working in silence.
Yeah, that is what everyone pictures. But early Christianity was a marginalized, often persecuted minority religion.
Right, they were hiding out.
They didn't have state-sponsored publishing houses. They absolutely did not. In the wider Roman world, the reproduction of texts was usually handled by educated slaves or trained professionals who copied books for commercial booksellers.
Okay.
But early Christian copyists were typically just literate members of the local congregation.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Often, these were the wealthier homeowners who had the physical space to host underground church gatherings. They were literate, certainly, but they were not trained in the highly specialized, rigorous discipline of professional scribal work.
So for the first few centuries, the people copying the foundational texts of Western history were essentially passionate amateurs working in their living rooms.
Yes, passionate amateurs. And we have to remember the physical realities of what they were dealing with.
I can't even imagine.
They were copying on papyrus, which is rough and fibrous, using ink that could blot easily.
And the lighting couldn't have been great.
Exactly. Furthermore, ancient Greek was often written something called Scriptio Continua.
What does that mean?
It means there were no spaces between the words, no punctuation, and no capital letters. It was just a continuous block of text.
Are you kidding? No spaces.
None.
Which is a recipe for disaster if you're a tired amateur scribe copying by the light of an oil lamp.
Oh, absolutely.
You look away for a second, look back, and you easily lose your place. It makes me think of reverse engineering a corrupted software code base.
That is a brilliant analogy.
You know, you have version 1.0, but the source code is gone. Instead, we have version 4.2 that some guy in Antioch patched, and version 4.3 from Alexandria, where another coder accidentally deleted a vital line of code because 2 lines ended with the exact same sequence of characters.
Yes, and that specific error you just described actually has a technical name. It is called Homoeoteleuton.
Homoeteleuton.
Which means similar endings. A scribe's eye would skip from the end of one sentence to the identical ending of the next, accidentally deleting everything in between.
Just completely erasing a chunk of the Bible.
Exactly. So you have this massive network of amateur copies spanning centuries with errors baking into the text.
It is a mess.
It really is. It wasn't until the 4th century, after Emperor Constantine converted and Christianity gained massive imperial backing, that professional Christian scriptoria finally emerged.
But hold on. By the time those highly trained professionals started copying in the 4th century, they were just making pristine, high-quality copies of texts that already had 300 years of amateur errors baked into the source code.
That is the great paradox of textual criticism.
I mean, they are polishing a flawed diamond.
Exactly. A beautifully illuminated, professionally produced, incredibly expensive manuscript from the 9th century is often far less reliable than a messy, hastily written, stained papyrus fragment from the 2nd century.
That is wild.
The professionals simply locked in the early amateur errors and standardized them.
But there's another layer to this software analogy. Because these scribes weren't just passively copying whatever text was handed to them, the 2nd and 3rd centuries were a period of intense theological chaos.
Oh, absolutely.
There wasn't a universally agreed-upon table of contents for the New Testament yet. You had competing factions with radically different views on who Jesus actually was.
The theological landscape was incredibly fractured. For example, you had adoptionists.
Okay, what they believe.
They believed Jesus was entirely human and was simply adopted by the divine at his baptism.
Interesting.
But on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, you had Docetists, who believed Jesus was entirely divine and only appeared to be human.
Wait, they thought he wasn't a physical person at all.
Exactly. To the point that they argued he didn't actually bleed or suffer on the cross. It was an illusion.
Wow.
And there were dozens of different gospels, acts, and epistles floating around that supported these various conflicting views.
Which brings us to Marcion. The source material highlights him as a massive catalyst for defining what actually made the cut.
Marcion is a fascinating figure.
He was a 2nd century leader who argued that the wrathful, law-giving deity of the Hebrew Bible was completely incompatible with the loving, merciful deity of Jesus.
Right. He thought they were literally two different gods.
So Marcion didn't wait for a council to decide things. He just created his own canon.
He took matters into his own hands.
He took the letters of Paul, heavily edited the Gospel of Luke, to physically cut out any positive references to Judaism or the Old Testament, and called it a day. 11 books.
That was his entire Bible.
Just those 11.
Marcion is crucial because his radical actions forced the hands of the proto-Orthodox Christian leaders.
They had to react.
Exactly. Until Marcion, the boundaries of what was considered sacred scripture were relatively porous. People were reading all sorts of things.
Right.
But when Marcion started strictly defining what was in and what was out, the Orthodox leaders realized they needed to draw their own strict lines to combat him, and other groups they viewed as heretical.
And the way they justified those lines is fascinating to me, because they aren't citing divine revelation to defend their choices. They are using the philosophical and cultural logic of their era.
Yes, the arguments sound very strange to us today.
Very strange. For example, the proto-Orthodox leader Irenaeus argued vehemently that there must be exactly 4 Gospels. Not 3, not 5, but 4.
And his reasoning wasn't based on manuscript authority at all.
No, he argued that just as there are 4 zones of the world and 4 principal winds, the church must predictably have 4 pillars.
It sounds completely arbitrary, almost superstitious to a modern ear.
It sounds like magical thinking.
It does. But in the context of ancient cosmology, establishing a parallel with the natural order was a serious, compelling theological argument.
Really?
Oh yeah. It proved divine design to them. This winnowing process took centuries, culminating in 367 CE, when a bishop named Athanasius wrote a letter listing the exact 27 books recognized as the New Testament today.
Okay, so that is when we finally get the modern list.
Yes. But if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the people defining this orthodoxy were the exact same people hand-copying the manuscripts.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting. Because they were so deeply invested in these intense theological turf wars, the changes they made to the text weren't just accidental typos like skipping a line.
No, they were highly intentional.
They were intentionally editing the source code to ensure it reflected their specific theological patch.
Exactly. They firmly believed they were copying sacred scripture, yes, but they also firmly believed heretics were actively corrupting it.
So they were on the defensive?
Very much so. If a scribe read a passage that sounded a little too adoptionist or a little too Docetic, they might tweak the phrasing to correct it back to what they assumed the author must have originally meant.
They were trying to fix it.
They were trying to protect the text, but by doing so, they fundamentally altered it.
The specific examples of this in the source material are just incredible.
Oh, there's so many good ones.
Let us take Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. Older manuscripts state that Christ manifests all things by the word of his power.
Okay.
A later scribe altered the Greek slightly, so it read that Christ bears or upholds all things.
A subtle shift, but an important theological one.
But the amazing part is this famous 4th century manuscript, Codex Vaticanus. You can actually see where a subsequent scribe came along, erased the alteration, restored the original word, and left an angry note in the margin.
I love that note.
It is amazing.
The note literally translates to, "Fool and knave, leave the old reading, don't change it."
They are literally fighting in the margins.
It is a tangible glimpse into this scribal warfare. They were actively fighting over the wording on the parchment itself, leaving a physical record of their theological disputes.
And it wasn't just internal Christian debates either. We also see edits made defensively against outside criticism.
Yes, the apologetic changes.
Like in Mark 1.41, a leper approaches Jesus to be healed. The earliest surviving text said Jesus became angry, reached out his hand, and healed him.
Which is a very human emotion.
But early pagan critics of Christianity, like the philosopher Celsus, were heavily mocking these texts. They argued that a truly divine being shouldn't be subject to base, irrational human passions like anger.
Right, the Greco-Roman ideal was emotional detachment for the divine.
So scribes, dealing with the apologetic nightmare of an angry Jesus, simply smooth the word out to compassion.
It was a PR move, essentially. We also see alterations motivated by internal social and cultural shifts.
The anti-Jewish edits.
Yes. In the Gospel of Luke, during the crucifixion, there's the famous prayer, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Everyone knows that line.
But that prayer is entirely missing from some of the earliest and most reliable manuscripts.
Really? Missing completely.
Completely. Textual critics argue it was likely omitted intentionally by later scribes due to rising anti-Jewish sentiment in the early church.
Wow.
As polemics against Jewish communities intensified, some scribes simply could not stomach the idea of Jesus extending forgiveness in that moment, so they cut the prayer out entirely.
They just deleted it. The sources also highlight how passages were altered to diminish the historical role of women, too.
That is another huge area of intentional change.
Because the early church started out as these egalitarian house churches where women often hosted and led. But as it evolved into a more rigid patriarchal hierarchy, scribes actively tweaked verses to downplay female leaders.
They really did.
They would change female names to male names, or insert commands for women to be silent in churches, actively silencing their voices in the narrative to reflect later church structures.
And this is a vital moment to clarify something crucial about the discipline of textual criticism.
Yeah, please do.
When scholars analyze these changes, whether they reflect ancient orthodox versus heretical theology or shifting social dynamics regarding gender, they are not taking sides.
Right. It is not about validating one theology over another.
Exactly. The goal of textual criticism is strictly impartial. The scholar is acting as a historian of the text, observing how these human debates physically mutated the historical manuscripts over time.
They're just tracking the data.
They aren't judging the theology, they're reconstructing the history.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of this detective work.
Yeah.
Because if we have thousands of manuscripts riddled with intentional theological edits, centuries of accidental slip-ups, and defensive apologetic tweaks, how do you even begin to parse what the original first-century document looked like?
It is an incredibly complex puzzle. The primary methodology scholars use today is called rational eclecticism.
Rational eclecticism.
It requires rigorously weighing both external and internal evidence. External evidence involves looking at the physical manuscripts themselves. Scholars categorize manuscripts into textual families or groupings based on shared characteristics and shared mistakes, which helps them trace a lineage back in time.
So, to use our software analogy again, if you have one older manuscript from Alexandria that has a highly specific typo and 50 later manuscripts from Byzantium that all have the exact same typo, you don't count that as 51 votes for that reading.
No, absolutely not.
You weigh them as a single branch of the family tree because those 50 just inherited the Alexandria typo. You're weighing the lineage, not just counting the sheer number of pages.
Exactly. It is not a democracy. A single high-quality papyrus from the 2nd century representing the Alexandrian text type might completely outweigh 50 medieval manuscripts from the Byzantine text type.
That makes total sense.
But external evidence alone isn't enough, which is where internal evidence comes in. You have to analyze the author's established vocabulary and stylistic tendencies. And, crucially, you have to analyze the psychology of the scribe.
The psychology of the scribe. And this leads to a rule developed by an 18th century scholar named Bengal, which seems incredibly counterintuitive at first glance.
Yes, Bengal's rule is brilliant.
It's the rule of transcriptional probability. It states that when you have two conflicting readings in the manuscripts, the more difficult reading is usually the original one.
It sounds backwards, doesn't it?
It totally does. But if I'm understanding this right, it's based on the idea that scribes were basically ancient editors. They wanted the text to make sense.
Exactly.
So if a sentence was grammatically awkward or theologically confusing, they would smooth it out. They wouldn't intentionally take a perfectly clear, harmonious sentence and make it confusing.
You've grasped the core mechanism perfectly. Think about the human nature of a copyist. If they encounter a verse that seems to contradict another verse or grammatical structure that feels clunky, their instinct is to harmonize and fix it.
They want to help the reader.
They want to clarify the text for their community. Therefore, the polished, easy-to-read, theologically sound version is almost always the later modification.
Right.
The awkward, difficult, or problematic reading is the older, original one, precisely because it is the version that later scribes felt compelled to fix.
Okay, so taking all of this into account, Ehrman's personal journey from fundamentalism, the passionate amateur scribes working by oil lamps, the intense theological battles over the canon, and the intricate science of rational eclecticism. What does this actually mean for you, the listener, interacting with these texts today?
Well, it fundamentally shifts the paradigm of how you interact with the Bible.
How so?
It moves you away from viewing the text as a flawless, static oracle dropped from the sky, and it allows you to engage with it as a rich, complex, deeply human historical document.
It is a product of its time.
It's written by humans, copied by humans, altered by humans, and translated by humans, all of whom brought their own perspectives, fears, and biases to the parchment.
And realizing that doesn't render the text useless.
Not at all.
If anything, losing the idea of this pristine, inerrant blueprint makes the history of the text far more fascinating. It breathes life into it.
It really does. The lack of original manuscripts isn't a dead end. It is a doorway.
I like that. A doorway.
Understanding the history of how these texts were transmitted offers a profoundly deeper understanding of early Christianity itself.
Because you see what they were struggling with.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that the profound irony is that the very act of early Christians trying so desperately to protect, conserve, and defend their sacred texts is exactly what drove them to alter them.
Wow.
The textual changes themselves serve as a historical fossil record of what the early church cared about, what they fought over, and what they feared.
That is amazing. And it leaves us with this incredible thought to chew on. Imagine if tomorrow an archaeologist digging in the sands of Egypt actually found it.
The holy grail of biblical archaeology.
Exactly. They brush away the dirt and unearth the original, handwritten, signed autograph of the Gospel of Mark. Given everything we've just discussed about how much the text was smoothed out, sanitized, and harmonized over the centuries to fit later theological frameworks, would finding the absolute original text actually resolve our modern religious debates, or would it just completely upend them?
That is the ultimate question of textual criticism.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating history of biblical manuscripts. We'll catch you next time.